When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. Occasions matter for arguments. That is to say, where arguments occur can influence what we say during disagreements. And that doesn't just mean that I might alter my tone if I'm arguing in a library or something like that. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, noticed the importance of occasion. He wrote about 3 types: ceremonial, forensic, and deliberative. Ceremonial, which, if we're being fancy, we can call the epideictic. These are occasions that call for arguments that are about us. Who are we? What are our values? What are our shared characteristics? Much of public discourse, graduation speeches, wedding speeches, funeral speeches and obituaries, you just founded a company, inaugural addresses, these are what we might call ceremonial because they all ask the same fundamental question: who are we? And the focus is largely in the present. Who are we now that we have graduated from college? A good wedding speech might focus on 2 wonderful people finding love and forming a new bond together. An affecting speech at a funeral might celebrate a person's life and showing how their legacy lives on among the gathered family and friends. A uniting inaugural address, think of My Fellow Americans, imagines a divided nation coming together for shared purposes. Abraham Lincoln was especially good at this. In his second inaugural address, delivered 41 days before his assassination in 1865, with his assassin in the audience, he said, "With malice towards none and charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Today's guest on When We Disagree is Sapna Suresh, a PhD in communication. She studies persuasion and social influence, including message design, message channels, and message interpretation. Sapna, tell us an argument story.
Hi, so I have a really interesting argument that deals with entertainment education.
What is entertainment education for those of us who don't know?
So it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's when you have one or more educational messages and they're couched in an entertaining format. So that could be something like a short film, a radio serial, a television program, or something like that. And it's grounded in a pretty rigorous theory of change. There's social cognitive theory that has influence. There's theories of identification. But the general idea behind it is to be able to convey a message subtly but effectively, typically about health issues, but I've also seen instances where they talk about social issues.
What are some famous examples where entertainment education has either worked or not worked as we kind of set up the argument?
Yeah, so there's some great examples. A lot of times this has been deployed in the developing world, but there's some also interesting examples from here in the US. One that immediately comes to mind is there was a Hulu show called East Los High, and that ran for multiple seasons, and it was centered around issues that were specific to Mexican American youth, Mexican American teens, and interested in issues such as like reproductive health, cancer screenings, things like that. And it's really about picking members of that target community or picking characters that resemble members of the target community and the kinds of issues that they genuinely and authentically experience, and curating a show that's sort of infused with learnings, but really for that community.
Okay. So what is the dispute that you've been in since you've researched this issue?
Yeah, so something that's really cool, I think, about being a communication researcher is it feels really accessible to people who are not academics. Like you're able to have a pretty easy discussion with them about things that you think are really technical, but are also super tangible to them. And so when I meet people for the first time and they ask what I study, this is one of the things that I like to bring up because I think it's really cool. People obviously like media. And I think that it's interesting that you can use media as a lever to teach people things too. And so I recall this one specific time when I was meeting somebody new, and they were in a creative profession, like totally outside the realm of academia. And I was beginning to explain this concept to them because just this is one example of how you can apply um, persuasion and social influence researches through entertainment education. And so when I was specifically bringing up that subtly yet effectively part, I got hit with an oof, that's kind of creepy. And that really took me by surprise. And now, granted, I didn't really get into the weeds about like, this is really good to address health disparities or systems of racism and oppression that undergird why these disparities exist. But it was a comment that kind of made me come to like a full stop in the moment.
Did the person elaborate on what's creepy?
Yeah, I would say I kind of stopped explaining after that, and we were in a group, so I think that the conversation kind of just pivoted from there. But I think my interpretation of it, and it was a kind of an off the cuff comment, and I think she might have said something else about it, but I think that it was clear that she thought it was strange that people were actually designing things to influence us and teach us using some sort of scientific principle without sort of the recipient's knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, spooling that out because it doesn't sound like you encountered a fully formed version of this argument, at least in this instance. Have you encountered this argument other than this one instance out of curiosity?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is I've heard this debate about kind of the ethics and the morality about interventions like this more so among academics. I
Hmm.
think that it's actually kind of cool that somebody else who was not an academic brought it up because I think it's kind of an insightful and valuable question to ask. Like, we know that advertisements are trying to do that. I think we all understand that they're trying to influence us to buy a product.
Yeah.
I think that there's something, and I think academics do a pretty good job of holding themselves to like a standard where they're like reflecting and critically thinking about the work that they do.
One would hope.
Sorry.
One would hope.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm lucky that I have encountered scholars who have like engaged in this debate, even though they're also people who work on entertainment education. And so I think that that kind of just, even though that was sort of a small interaction and I've talked about it with people in the academy, I think that just kind of set me on a spiral where I, was thinking about who are we really to decide what's good for others? Like a lot of times these are seeking to address adverse health consequences. For example, unintended pregnancy and the way that can derail education and the opportunity for high paying jobs. But I also think about how here in the US, we learn about potential negative consequences of unintended teenage pregnancy, and yet people oftentimes choose to carry the pregnancy to term and have the child, and they have the free will, they have the choice. And I think that there is something that's kind of fraught about us trying to convince other people that that is necessarily a bad thing and trying to subvert their ability to make that choice.
Your position in this is pretty interesting because as a research, it's not like you're working for Hulu yet, designing shows with an agenda in mind, thinking, well, how can we get this target population to wear more sunscreen through Clifford the Big Red Dog or
Mm-hmm.
whatever the character is? And that's just one silly example that I'll attach to. And there are many, many more, as you well know. But the question motivating the research is often, what is it? How does it show up? What works? What doesn't work? Not necessarily, is this ethical or unethical? Although that's certainly a class of research you could do. So, what was it about this person's comment that it was creepy that struck you so much when your research largely concerns what works and what doesn't?
Yeah, I think it was just like a meta comment that made me think like what really, like I have this innate sense, this innate understanding, this reflexive thought that what I'm doing has value, it's noble, it's good. And I think what really made me pause was thinking, is this all in pursuit of designing a message that ultimately is doing some harm. In my experience, I've worked actually a little bit with a nonprofit that does produce these shows. And what I'll say that I really appreciate about them is that they have teams who are on the ground in the countries that they develop the programs for. And they do a lot of formative research. So that's sort of just like open-ended focus groups, interviews with members of the target communities. So I think what is good, the one thing that I think is sort of counteracting this concern I have is I think that they establish the parameters of the show and they tailor it very much based on that formative research. So they, have this theory of change of how they're going to ultimately influence behavior. But I think to some extent, there are these health problems that exist, but they also kind of capture the nuance and capture sort of the will and the wants of the members of these communities by some of those open-ended initial interviews before developing the program.
Of the entertainment education genre, how much of it is produced by these well-meaning nonprofits?
I think a lot of them are produced by nonprofits. Um, I don't think I would say it's not super common in the US. I think that there's sometimes government agencies who will make like short films. For example, like I mentioned, avoiding unintended pregnancy. There was a short film that I believe was developed through a grant from the government that was to be played in Planned Parenthood waiting rooms. That was about the efficacy and the utility of getting a long acting reversible contraceptive. Um, and so I think it tends to not be for profit organizations, which I think also kind of works in its favor. It's like there's something maybe that feels a little less malicious about it when it's a nonprofit or a government body. But I also still feel like I can't ignore that we're a Western country and we're kind of making decisions about what needs to be produced for countries in the global South. Um, I think that that's another thing that just kind of weighs on my mind of, this is not a thing that the person brought up, but it kind of exploded in my mind and made me think about all of these ethical implications.
In the end, the question of creepiness seems to come down to an issue of both the prior consent of the audience to be exposed to a persuasive message, and then also the position of the producer. Who are
Mm-hmm.
these folks? How have they made a value decision? And then why do they feel like I need to be persuaded to go back to my example, to wear more sunscreen or whatever it is? And so in the end, did this person's comment, and when you've been exposed to this kind of anti entertainment education argument, did it bring up something in you where you were tacitly defending it and thinking, this is a pro-social avenue of change here, and hadn't questioned the ethics of it so much, or at least from this point of view, and you thought, well, maybe I need to pause on my tacit support?
Yeah, definitely. I think that that sort of summarizes my internal conflict really well, which is I've kind of on autopilot like co-signed this for a long time. It kind of
Yeah,
made me pause and think about what's really the implication of this. Like I think that there is this genuine benefit, but I also feel like there are larger philosophical, ethical questions that are more in our consciousness these days. And I think especially with the way that people think about like the media having like necessarily having particular bias. And I think it's something that's just more at the forefront of everybody's mind. And so I think it's, even though this isn't explicitly like political or trying to convey like a the need to buy a certain product, I think that this is, yeah, thought of in a way that's supposed to be pro-social very much. But I think even those instances where we're trying to be persuasive for pro-social gain, I think we need to be a little bit reflective and make sure that we're having, even if not the explicit consent, we're getting some sort of input. We're getting some sort of a green light from people who are going to be receiving the message, so it's not just sort of fully being manipulative.
that's right. And we can certainly think of examples, whether it's the debates about subliminal messaging after World War II that were so controversial, or propaganda in Looney Tunes cartoons, again after World War II, or during the Cold War, that functioned as entertainment education that obviously had a clear political agenda, that were made in support of a political agenda, but also by private corporations and
Absolutely.
mass exposed to a population that didn't really sign up for it. And
Mhm.
so certainly there are these more limited examples, the contraception example you give, but also we've all experienced these on some level. Entertainment education, it really just sort of depends on how broadly you define it.
Right, because I think that that infuses a lot. Like that is sort of, I think, the cornerstone of a lot of like children's programming is trying to teach them about like
Right.
values, like right and wrong, trying to teach them about like the way that they should act in the world. And I think, yeah, again, it's very much done, I think, with the positive intention. Um, but like you mentioned, there's all of those examples. I think that there were some um, used to really not sure what the word I'm looking for is, rile up the youth, the Hitler youth,
Sure.
uh, preceding World War or like leading into World War II. So yeah, I think that there's also like the possibility for harm for children, and yeah, it's something to just be, I think, conscious of. You're right, because we've seen ways in which this is played out in history that have been less than ideal, even when sponsored by the government.
Mm-hmm. Sapna, thank you so much for being on When We Disagree.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.